All right, let's now bring in former White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer. Sean, thanks so much for joining me on the U.S. Report. I want to get your thoughts, first of all, on this devastating plane crash in Washington, D.C. And it seems like from the outset, the left have decided to start throwing political charges at the president that somehow his hiring freezes and other things like that could have been responsible. What do you make of this?
Well, I mean, I don't think it passes the smell test, right? I mean, the president was inaugurated, what, 10 days ago? Not even 8 days ago, the 20th. So we're literally 10 days in. No one took a job or lost a job in the last 10 days that was part because of the Trump administration. And frankly, the more we find out, I think the more that we're probably going to see that it was Pete Buttigieg and his handling and his lack of leadership as Department of Transportation Secretary that really comes into focus here. I mean, Pete Buttigieg was probably the worst cabinet pick. You think about every aspect that he was in charge of, our railways, our seaways, our airways, our highways. There wasn't one area that didn't have a major crisis under his tenure at the Department of Transportation. He was really good at running to the cameras to take credit when he thought it was advantageous, but he always hid from crises. And look, I will tell you, having been part of President Trump's team and in the White House, I think the president, there was a reason that he was focusing on the FAA and Pete Buttigieg's leadership and priorities. It's sad, but, you know, I pointed this out about the Department of Agriculture a couple months ago, right after the election. You go to these home pages of the agencies and the departments throughout government under the Biden administration, and their priorities weren't their mission, right? In the case of the Department of Agricultural Food Safety or the Department of Transportation, you know, the safety of our transportation modals. In fact, they talked about diversity and equity, inclusion, and that's like, that shouldn't be the priority of any of these departments. If they want to make it number 15 on while Dems are in office, whatever. But it really just showed where the priorities were the last 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think I heard somebody once say that Pete Buttigieg was such an incompetent transportation secretary that Americans actually knew who the transportation secretary was, which I think is a position you don't want to be in at all. But I also want to move on to... By the way,
just, you know,
oh, yeah.
We talk a lot about nominations and qualifications. I wrote a book, my second book out, where I noted, actually it's my third book, Radical Nation. And I wrote a chapter on a bunch of the qualifications of some of the Biden nominees. Pete Buttigieg was the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. And this is not a joke. Absolute truth. We went back and looked at the number of buses that he oversaw as mayor, and it was 66. That somehow qualified him to be the transportation secretary. 66 buses were part of the South Bend, Indiana bus fleet. That was his, and it showed, because every area that he was responsible for as Secretary of Transportation had a crisis where he failed.
It was, and we all remember that too, with the train crashes in Palestine, Ohio, and places like that, and crises at the ports. Yes, absolutely, 100% utter incompetence, and I think that reflects exactly what we had over the last 4 years, and I think, unfortunately, we're still dealing with some of the hangover from that. But I want to move on, though, too, because also you were a former press secretary yourself, and I feel like you are the perfect person to ask about this. There's a new sheriff in town in the White House press briefing room, Carol Levitt, and I want to just play this little comparison between her and her predecessor, the late Karine Jean-Pierre.
When you're up here in this briefing room speaking to the American public, do you view yourself and your role as speaking on, advocating on behalf of the president, or providing the unvarnished truth that is, you know, not to lie, not to obfuscate to the American people?
I commit to telling the truth from this podium every single day. I commit to speaking on behalf of the President of the United States. That is my job. And I will say it's very easy to speak truth from this podium when you have a president who is implementing policies that are wildly popular with the American people, and that's exactly what this administration is doing. It's correcting the lies and the wrongs of the past 4 years, many of the lies that have been told to your faces in this very briefing room. I will not do that. But since you brought up Truth-Seek, I would like to point out, while I vowed to provide the truth from this podium, we ask that all of you in this room hold yourselves to that same standard.
How do you think she's going? I think she's a real breath of fresh air, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, look, it was. I tweeted it out. Caroline retweeted it, as a matter of fact. But I just said, what a breath of fresh air to have a press secretary who has two things that the last one didn't. One, real information when it came to answering people's questions. And two, and this is equally important, Caroline clearly has access to President Trump, as I did, as all of his press secretaries did. But there's no question, whether it was Jen Psaki or Karine Jean-Pierre, that they didn't have access to President Biden. They didn't see him. Nobody did. As a matter of fact, they hid the guy. And so I think that she has two things that were missing the last 4 years. They're going to make her much more successful in that role.
And finally, Sean, while I've got you here, kind of talk about some of these amazing hearings we've had up on Capitol Hill over President Trump's nominees here. I want to play a little bit of Robert Kennedy's hearing, which got pretty contentious. Have a look at Kennedy having a go at Bernie Sanders for accepting millions of dollars from Big Pharma. Check this out.
In 2020, you were the single largest
because I had
receiver of pharmaceutical money.
Contributions from workers all over this country. Workers,
you were the
not a nickel from corporate tax.
You were the single largest acceptor of pharmaceutical dollars.
No, from workers in
1.5 million.
Yeah, out of 200 million.
Now, I'll be honest, Sean, I haven't been convinced by everything Kennedy says, but I do think he has a bit of a point about the way Big Pharma dominates and pours money into American life, even as Americans seem to keep getting sicker.
Oh, yeah. I mean, first of all, there's two issues at hand. Don't you love Bernie Sanders' response on that? He goes, yeah, it was only 45 million of 200 million that I raised. A guy who's anti-establishment for the small guy says, let me tell you why it's not that big of a deal, because I actually raised millions more than you're even giving me credit for. It was, what an excuse to say $45 million is a drop in the bucket compared to the 200 million that I actually raised. Okay, that's number one. Number two, Robert F. Kennedy, the irony of all of this is that this is a guy who is probably enemy number one of Big Pharma in this country and of big food. So as much as they're pouring money into these campaigns of politicians on both sides of the aisle, Robert F. Kennedy is speaking truth to power when it comes to the cover-up, the conflicts of interest that exist in both big food and Big Pharma to collude with government to prevent us. And there was no better example than just the other day in the United States. Now, I don't know about Australia, but I know in Europe, red dye number 3 has been banned for decades. In the United States, we haven't been able to use it for cosmetics, but it's in things like Gatorade and Pop-Tarts, all sorts of foods that we eat. And finally, out of nowhere, because of the pressure of people like Robert F. Kennedy and the Make America Healthy Again movement, the FDA out of nowhere just said, yeah, we're going to finally ban it. It is bad. You're right. It does cause cancer. It was unbelievable. But if it wasn't for that pressure, it would have never happened. So Robert F. Kennedy, ironically, is the one guy who's willing to speak truth to power when it comes to Big Pharma and big food.
Well, apparently it is banned here in Australia, too. But, you know, I guess it's so funny when these things change and they change the rules because, hey, I thought the science was settled. Sean Spicer, thank you so much for joining me here. Check out the Sean Spicer Show.